Oh, my volume is on. Hello to the folks on Zoom. I'm just running a couple minutes behind today. I think it's the post-spring break slowness here. So a couple quick reminders, your exam 2 is due in class on Wednesday. So you've got some time to finish that if you haven't yet. And then we're going to continue doing a lot of in-class assignments. We'll probably do another one on Wednesday. Just realized the room is in yet another totally different configuration today. I hadn't really looked up yet. Like, oh, okay. Everybody needs their space, apparently. It's like little kids, like, don't touch me. All the tables have this like separation. Midterm report should be posted tomorrow. I went in and put in zeros for things you're missing. That doesn't mean you can't go back and do them, right? But I just wanted you all to know, if you didn't turn any of that stuff in, where would you be, essentially? So as you turn it in, I'll clear the zeros on a blackboard. But I just think at midterm, it's fair to tell people like, hey, if this is all you did, this is what would happen. If you have an F on your midterm, it does not mean you can't pass the class. And it actually doesn't mean you can't get an A in the class. It just means you probably need to start turning some more stuff in particular for this class, as several people hadn't done any of the perusals. So that's going to affect your grade. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen. And we'll talk about bias in science. I have tried to go through and fix all of these lectures now that I know the problem of, for those who weren't here the day before break, I finally figured out why sometimes my YouTube videos don't work. Apparently, so we use the Google Suite for Education, and apparently it's sort of made for K through 12 schools. So anything that doesn't have like a G rating on it, basically doesn't have a rating at all, it will block from embedding. And so I can still show it, I just have to find the links. So I've been trying to work through all of those. And so, you know, we all figure out technology and all of the things it does for and against us, right? Okay. All right. And so I don't know how many people, because it was fall break, got the chance to do the perusal or do the reading, but a lot of the questions I'm going to ask today are pretty, you can answer them without the reading. They're fairly abstract, right? And so I'm still going to ask them, and we can still chat about them. And so, you know, whether or not you've done the reading, and folks on Zoom, you could chime in the comments if you want. How do you think that race plays a role in people's psychology? And you don't have to share any personal experiences if you've had it, but just sort of thinking abstractly about how race, and particularly how race is situated in our world today, might affect people's psychology. Yeah, Caleb. Yeah, that's such a good point, that there are people who don't think, they'll say stuff like, I can't see color, right? And they'll say things like race doesn't matter. There's no prejudice. And yeah, that's going to profoundly affect you if you're experiencing that every single day. And they're basically gaslighting you, right? Yeah. Looks like we got something in the chat here. Unconscious judgment or otherwise different treatment. Yeah, sometimes we do not even realize that we are doing this, right? And this can be people of any race towards other races. We can have internalized racism as well. And, you know, just based on what y'all have, oh, we got something from Bryn too. Dealing with discrimination can negatively affect people's psychology and also affects their ability to get necessary psychological help. Yeah, due to racial biases and financial restraints. I think we looked at it earlier in the semester, but there are very few people out there, unfortunately, who are trained as psychologists and practicing and licensed and all that good stuff. So that makes it really tough, right? When you want to get help, you maybe want to get help from someone who has been through some of the same things you have, but only, whatever it is, 5% of people are people of color who are psychologists, right? So that makes it really difficult as well. And some of this I'm realizing we talked about before. I think I assigned this article twice unintentionally. So we've talked about what journals this gets published in, right? Unfortunately, that's often in niche journals. People will say that looking at race is beyond the scope of a normal journal, which is absurd, right? And it's typically scholars of color who are writing it and who are editing the journals where it gets published. So, again, we'll still have people saying things like, there's no bias, it's not a problem, when in fact, it is a problem. And we're seeing it in the numbers of things that get published, right? And that can be a real problem. And so I'm going to take just a second here to check off the folks who are on Zoom, just because I cannot check and talk at the same time, at least not well. There we go. Cool. So yes, psychology has a problem in terms of representation. And psychology has a problem in terms of acknowledgement of this. One of your articles, which I hope you'll enjoy when you do go to read it, is by one of my favorite authors, Cordelia Fine. And so this is talking about sexism. And one of the things that has become pretty popular, maybe since the late 90s, is to try to argue that the differences between men and women are because of brain-based differences. So it's like this whole new brand of sexism where they try to justify everything by saying, well, that's just how their brains are made. So again, not needing to rely on the article, but if you just think about how, like, what you hear in the popular media, or what you might have even learned in other psych classes, what do we think about and what do we talk about in terms of like males and females and their brains being different and who's better at doing what? Like if you just think of like conversations, what people say doesn't have to be right in a lot of cases. It's not. So like people will say stuff like, oh, boys are just better at math, right? Boys are better at spatial reasoning. Oh, girls are just better at taking care of people. Even within adult marriages, people will be like, well, women, your brains are just wired better to do chores, so you should do all the chores, right? There's something that's pretty popular on socials right now that people are talking about called weaponized incompetence, where people who don't want to engage in housework will do it wrong on purpose, or like say they don't know how to do it so that they don't have to do it in the future. Right, and it could be either partner, but it's typically the male partner, right? And so one of the things that happens here is that people assume those are existing in the brain, inherent, not taught. And in fact, when Fine goes back and reanalyzes this data, what she finds is that it's not true, right? A lot of this stuff kind of washes out. And there's a lot of other things that affect things. So I don't remember if she talks about it in this particular article, but she has a book that I've read, and she talks about if you ask people just to report their gender, give them a demographics form at the beginning of an experiment and say, what's your gender? Women will do worse tests that are considered like good for men, like math and spatial reasoning, than if you ask them their gender at the end. So just trying people with what gender are you is enough to get women to do less well. And so that this is not inherent, this is not biologically wired into our brains, and in fact, that our brains are really not that different, shockingly, right? And that a lot of what we assume are these inborn things are in fact learned, right, over time. And we know that learning changes our brain. We know that we can develop new neural pathways or get rid of them if they're used or not. And we also know that a lot of the studies these conjectures are made on are the same thing I keep coming back to and keep harping on, which is the idea that there are these really small brain scan studies, right? 20 people, 10 men, 10 women. Well, right, what if I pulled 10 women who were engineers at NASA, right? And 10 men who were nurses, right? We might get totally opposite, right? And I remember it was really interesting. Back when I was in college and I took the Psychology of Women course, we watched this little clip from the show 2020 news show, where they were talking about how these differences are just inherent and boy and girl toddlers will act different. And they were like, on the day we were there though, the boys cried more. They tried to like write it off, but it was just like, well, clearly it's not all the time, right? And clearly there are issues. And again, just the fact that despite everything they've had to do to fight to get there, right, and still have to fight to get there, we do have very successful women in the STEM fields. We do have very successful women in jobs that are stereotypically seen as male. And so a lot of times they do better than men. So like if you have a female surgeon, you're less likely to have complications. Your hospital stay will be shorter. You're less likely to need a second surgery, things along those lines, right? But that's still not the narrative. And so women who go into those fields, and particularly women of color who go into these fields, I mean, if you watch the movie Hidden Figures, right, which took place right up on the peninsula, they show everything those women had to overcome to just like do the job they knew they could do, right? And unfortunately, we still have that. We still have science scholars who go into their offices and are accosted by security and say, what are you doing trying to break into this lab? Just because they're like a woman or a person. So no, I'm a faculty member. And so we know that we have a long way to go, and yet people do not acknowledge these additional barriers. And so they'll still point to, well, women aren't succeeding as much, women aren't doing this. Right? And then you look at, again, like a team, including a woman, just won the Nobel Prize for medicine for their work on developing mRNA vaccines. The woman part of that team in the 1990s was told by her university that her work was not of faculty quality. And they demoted her to an adjunct professor, basically. And then that same university posted about it on Twitter and tried to take credit for her work. And I loved it because every single, no exception, every single comment in response was, how dare you, right? And yet people will try to do that. People will try to take credit for what people of color do, what women do, right? And so they have all these barriers. And so yes, they might not be as successful, but that's not because their brains aren't wired to do it. Right, and that becomes a really important piece of this to keep in mind. Alrighty, and again, thinking about this more abstractly, I know that a couple of people in here are either currently taking GWSS with me or have taken with me in the past. So what is intersectionality? Yeah.
It's really concept that you're not defined solely by personality or your ethnicity, race, sex, that you're a something else person.
Exactly, yes. For those of you who couldn't hear what I was saying, it was a great definition. You're not defined by one thing, one aspect of your personhood, but by all of those things, and all of those things interact. So this theory was originally developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar, to talk about how the discrimination that Black women face is distinct from what white women face or what Black men face. But since then, it's been expanded to include all manner of things. So for example, we know that if you are, say, in a large body and a lesbian and a woman of color, that unfortunately that means you will have an even harder time doing things than, say, a stereotypically attractive. I don't want to imply that anyone in a large body couldn't be attractive, right? But a stereotypically attractive, straight white woman. And so that's intersectionality, the idea that we need to be thinking about more than just one aspect of a person. So for example, if you look at the wage gap, people will talk about the wage gap between men and women. And so it's about women in general, think about 79 cents on the dollar to what a white man makes. But you break that down more and you look at, say, Latina women, they make 54 cents on the dollar to what a white man makes, right? So we need to look at that intersectionality because that's very important. So having talked about that, why would you think that more researchers in psychology are starting to talk about, include intersectionality in their research? And again, people on Zoom, always feel free to chime in the chat. Why would researchers in psychology suddenly be interested in intersectionality?
Yeah. Because we realize that it's not every aspect of the listening to
Exactly, yeah, that we need to be thinking about everything in a person. And I mean, as we talked about here before, one of the problems with pre-existing psychological research is it's typically the samples are very white, right? And so we need to take into account that the experience of white individuals are probably not the same as people of color, and of males are not the same as women, right? So we need to be thinking about that. The other reason, to be perfectly honest, is that there are trends in psychology, and people sometimes jump on the trends. And you know, that can be good or bad, right? As long as you're doing good, solid research, including intersectionality, fantastic. If you're just trying to get more publications because that's trendy, do that, right? And so these are the questions that Cole says we should be asking about social category. Who is included in this category, right? So if we're saying women of color, for example, are we talking about anyone who's non-white? Are we talking specifically about Black or Latinx women? Are we including Indigenous peoples? Are we including people of Asian descent? Right? We need to be precise about how we're thinking about this. Because, for example, Asian women actually do as well or a little bit better than white women in terms of the pay gap. That doesn't mean they're not disadvantaged in other ways. What role does inequality play? We need to be thinking about that as well, right? So who has been systematically often, right, excluded from spaces? Who has a harder time getting into those spaces, right? So one of the things I didn't realize is that a lot of people who go get PhDs also have parents who have PhDs, which is not the case for me or actually most of my classmates. We were all kind of first gen PhD people. But just. People talk about how much easier it is to navigate academia and grad school if you have a parent who's been there, right? Whereas, you know, I'm just figuring it out for myself, I had no idea. My parents had been to college, but not to this type of grad school, right? Think about money barriers, right? So med school, right? Law school, even a lot of PhD programs. You're taking out giant loans to try to pay for them, right? But if you can just pay out of pocket, when you graduate, you're at a distinct advantage over your colleagues because you're not having to spend your first however many years just trying to work off that debt, right? You can start buying a house sooner, like you normally would. We also need to think about the similarities, right? So like, how is the experience of people who are members of the LGBTQ plus community similar to members of certain racial or ethnic groups, right? What similar inequalities have they faced? I think along those lines. And so this I really liked, this was included in Cole's article. And this is how you can look at those three questions we just talked through at every step of the research process. So, you know, just thinking about generating your hypothesis, coming up with your idea that you're going to do the research on. Are you attuned to diversity within the categories you're considering? Are you looking at the social and historical context of inequality, right? Unfortunately, there's still a lot of politicians, researchers, policymakers, right, who just say, well, people of color have poorer health. That's it. Or they try to blame it on people of color and not look at the health inequities and how, like, if you don't have good insurance, you can't access preventative care. And that if you live in a food desert where there's no grocery store you can walk to, you're very limited in the foods that you have access. And then similarities, right? Maybe no one has looked at this before because people love to research differences and you're much more likely to get published if you research differences. So you might just have to be like, this is exploratory. We're gonna see what the similarities are because no one else has bothered to look at it yet, right? Sampling. So sampling is how you get your population that's going to be part of your study, right? And again, typically we're engaging in what's called convenience sampling, where we just sort of say, hey, college students, sign up for extra credit. We do that here, right? So if you want to be doing this work in an intersectional context, you need to be thinking about how do I find those people who aren't usually included in research samples, right? And so you might need to have more money to do that research, right? When I do my research on people who are gender or sexual minorities, I could do it here, but I wouldn't collect as much data. Whereas if I go through sites where I pay people to participate, I'm able to get those samples. And thinking about how the members of these categories, market groups with unequal access to power and resources, and even their ability to participate in this research, right? If your family doesn't have the means to send you to college, then you're never going to be a person in those convenience samples, right? And then different similarities. You want to look at diverse groups connected by a common relationship with social and institutional power. Operationalization. Waking up the board, right? So this is how we are defining the variables we're thinking about, we're manipulating, we're testing. So if we're developing a new measure, you don't want to develop it from the same old white European American centric perspective, right? We need to think about the perspective of the groups being studied, and so good measurement developers will actually sit down with focus groups and get ideas from the people they want to study. If you're talking about differences, you want to conceptualize them as stemming from structural inequality rather than as, again, individual level differences. A lot of people do this. A lot of people, again, very well-meaning researchers in psychology and the other social sciences and medicine will be like, well, because this person didn't take care of themselves. It's like, okay, let's take 5 steps back and see why they couldn't take care of themselves. They had to work 3 jobs, so they never had time to go to the doctor, right? When they do go to the doctor, their concerns are not taken seriously. We know that happens to people who are in larger bodies, people of color, women. They go to the doctor, concerns are not taken as seriously. They're likely to brush off your physical health concerns and blame them on psychological things. It takes longer to get a diagnosis. It takes longer to get pain medication. Right? Those are structural and activity problems that we need to be thinking about, not blaming it on the individual. And in terms of similarities, we think about social categories in terms of individual and institutional practices, again, rather than blaming the individuals for what's happening. When we do our data analysis, again, just like we just talked about with intersectionality, we don't want to say everyone who's a woman is the same. Everyone who is African American is the same, right? We want to look for nuances within those groups. We also want to test for both similarities and differences. And that kind of goes over to the other one as well. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, you're much more likely to get published if you find significant differences. People just love that good P less than 0.05. If you're not finding differences, they're like, why are we bothering? Well, looking for the non-differences is more important in some cases, right? So, couple of my sort of people I look up to, Janice Hyde and Alice Eagley, they do large scale meta-analyses where they take lots of studies on gender differences and put them together and see what comes out. And when you do that, you see a lot of this stuff washes out. A lot of the stuff, there isn't actually any gender difference at all. And it was Hyde, who I saw spoke at the at APA probably 20 years ago. And she said, I fight not with data, and not with my fists, but with data. Right? Like that's how she fights inequality, by showing these things. And then how we interpret those findings. Right? So a lot of researchers, if there weren't differences, would say, they're either gonna just sort of write them off in the discussion, or they're gonna engage in what we call the file drawer problem. There are not significant differences, gonna just throw this in a folder. It used to be literally you threw your data in a file drawer and you closed it, you didn't try to publish it, right? We need to be interpreting these things with a critical eye. What does it mean if there are not differences, right? What does it mean to look at these differences and what conclusions can we draw? We can't say, because I've had 30 African American people and 70 European American people in my study, I can now generalize to every African American and European American person in our grade. Of course you can't. People do it all the time. And again, you want to keep those structural positions in mind. It's not the fault of the people who are marginalized, right? And then we also, again, want to be sensitive to the nuance variations across the board. Even when we see similarities, acknowledging that there's also distinct things, right? Again, we're thinking of people of color. It's not always been this way, but we've gotten to the point in our society where in general, in roles like academia, medicine, things along those lines, people of Asian American descent tend to be more respected than people of color of other areas of descent, like Hispanic, or African American, right? So keeping in mind those nuances. This is again a really interesting article that talks about how to avoid sexism in your psychological research. And this was published by Florence Denmark, a huge name in psychology back in the 80s. So we've been thinking about avoiding sexism, right, for 40 plus years. And yet, we still see it all the time, right? And so very similar to what we just talked about, we need to think about when we're coming up with our hypothesis, right? Are we just sort of knee-jerk saying, well, this is a math fact, so men will be better at it? Okay, but why? Right? Are we only including one sex or the other? I would say, expanding this today, we need to also be thinking about, are we only including two sexes, right? Are we including individuals who are outside the gender binary? There are now 5 to 8% of the population identified as outside of the gender binary. So when we're not including them, it's starting to become irresponsible, right? Our methods, right? How are we measuring things? How are we doing things? So for example, even if you look at something like math skills, where again, like we typically say, oh, well, men do better, boys do better. That's true if you look at like standardized tests. But if you look at grades and math classes, women and girls do better. Right? So how are you operationalizing that? And who does that I'm just not gonna say it again. Who does that definition benefit? Right? Maybe you should look at it both ways. And then same thing. Data analysis and interpretation. What are you looking at? What assumptions do you make out of it? Do you blow off similarities because there's not a significant difference? Or do you talk about what does it mean if there's not actually a significant difference in that men and people who are outside the gender binary all do equally well on this test, right? And then our conclusions, again, we don't want to overgeneralize. It's a really like, people are often very tempted to do this in psychology and be like, well, then this could apply to blah, 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 blah. Probably not, right? We want to be careful. Alrighty. So this is something that I do want to pull up for you all. Because this is something very important that just came about 2 years ago. Oh, we're working on one for indigenous peoples now. That's good. So this is something that the American Psychological Association did. And actually, when I prepped this class 2 years ago, just the draft resolution is out. So that's what you all have on perusal. And this is basically APA finally owning up to all the shit they've done over the years. APA and psychology in general have not always been great. And in fact, a lot of times they have been horrific to people of color. And there are a couple different things related to this. So basically they talk about APA was established by white male leadership. And a lot of folks who were early psychologists and really even into the 70s were into eugenics. And so eugenics is the idea that there's like one group of people who is more worthy of procreating. And in psychology in particular, not only was this racial, right, and poverty based, but it was also based on people who had psychological disorders. So if you were defined as feeble-minded, typically if you were not, basically not what was considered psychologically normal. So if you had any psychological disorder, if you had a developmental delay, they would forcibly try to keep you from reproducing. And they were much more likely to do that of people of color. Yeah, psychology created, sustained, and promulgated ideas of human hierarchy through the construction, study, and interpretation of racial difference. APA has also already said that human rights are universal and inalienable. What? Shocker. They're denouncing racism, but they're fully acknowledging we effed up, right? And so I'm going to try to find, which is heart-wrenching, but important to see, is, I think it's this. They put out, no, this is just this. There's a timeline that they put out. So I'm going to try to find that real quick. Yeah, here we go. Historical chronology. And so this gives some of the examples of some of the horrific things psychology engaged with. And I think it's really important that we, as people who are students of psychology, acknowledge these things, right? We saw scientific racism in a psychological review within its first year of being established. First Peoples and Black participants were reported to having faster reaction times than white participants. And they said this is a primitive reflex, and that the superior, more involved intelligence of white participants resulted in more contemplative thoughts. So again, psychology's inception as a field, we're already doing this, right? Studying Black and white children. The very first tests that were for achievement and intelligence were really to say that kids who were of people of color were inferior, right? So there's a lot on that. The founding president of the APA had racist things about First Nations peoples, which are what we call Indigenous or American Indian folks, in his book. Race heredity being used, eugenical review, right? More tests that are used to basically justify racism and violence. More eugenics, lots of eugenics. Yerkes on just the Committee on Psychological Examination of Recruits. And again, saying that the Black recruits are morons, quote unquote. This is our history. This is what we need to know. And then, again, always examining racial differences to the detriment of non-white people, right? And this just going on and on. It wasn't until 1933 that we had the first African-American woman earn their PhD. You know, and we've been giving them for a while. The Clarks, now we're starting to see some good stuff. The Clarks did their doll study. They gave Black children white and black dolls, and they asked them which doll is prettier, which doll is more intelligent, and they kept pointing to the white doll. And this was actually used in an amicus brief in the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case to show that it wasn't separate but equal. We were actually harming Black children. So then we started to do some better things, but we were still not great, right? And here is someone who was going against the Clarks, who was a former APA president. He's like, it's not going to be harmful to keep schools segregated. And again, on and on and on and on. Some good things, but lots of bad things, honestly. And again, to this day, if we keep going, you know, they go up to 2019, showing that here are those statistics in the field of psychology, right? 81%, 83% of our folks are white in 2019, right? This is showing we are not a field that is supporting scholars of color. And you know, I am a member of the APA, and I have had issues with them and debated, you know, keeping my membership. I kept it in sort of deference to the fact that they keep trying to get better. And I do enjoy their convention when I go. But their convention, I did go this year in August, and the theme was "You Belong Here." And it just felt so much like lip service, right? And like, look, we did this one thing, and so you belong here. And I quote Daniel Tiger, great philosopher. My folks this show. So there's a song that he sings that says, "Saying I'm sorry is the first step. Then how can I help?" Right? And so, yeah, we've had this big apology, we've had this airing of grievances, right? But this is not Festivus, right? You're not just like written off for that. What do you all think APA can do to actually make changes? To actually back up this apology and actually support scholars of color? And again, we're still figuring it out, so there's definitely no right or wrong questions here. Like if you just wanted to make an organization more welcoming to people of color, how would you do it? Yeah, so having people in those leadership positions, right? And that's really important. Our CEO of APA, Arthur Evans, is African American. And it was really interesting. I did go to one of the panels on belongingness. And it was Arthur Evans interviewing some scholars who were doing work on belongingness. And one of them is actually the psychologist who works at Sesame Workshop, which are the people who put on Sesame Street. And she showed a clip where they have it's really sad. They now actually have an African American Muppet, whatever you want to call it, like, oh my God. In our year of 2023. But they showed him and his dad going to the barber shop. And Arthur Evans was like, that just makes me feel like a worm inside. And she's like, yeah, that's what we were trying to pull, right? Is that feeling of what is it like? And that's a common experience, right? And they haven't necessarily had that, although some of their Muppets certainly, it's like implied in it. Like, we have a really interesting book called Red or Blue, I Like You. And it's like Elmo goes to visit one of his friends and they live in an all blue Muppet neighborhood, right? And then that friend comes to visit Elmo on Sesame Street and sees all the diversity. And there's some stereotypical things like Elmo's family is eating fried chicken, right? But it's just sort of thinking about, let's get beyond the metaphor and actually be open about it. What are some other ways we could be more actually welcoming, actually supportive of folks of color in an organization? I mean, we could even think at Wesley, right? Or, a club within Wesleyan or a major. I mean, our faculty is like super diverse and was like, the Brown Hair Club, but all of us, right? Yeah, I think that's really important too, right? Being involved in policy and activism and supporting mental health and things along those lines, and yeah, scholarships, things along those lines, right? My national organization, which is the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, the board just gave all the special interest groups some funding, but the ones that represent marginalized people even more funding to do the work that they've been doing around supporting and welcoming minority members. And so like stuff like that, little things, they start to say something, right? Where you put your money shows where your priorities is. And so that becomes really important, right? Like Wesleyan started this Africana Studies minor, but now it's kind of fizzled and like there's not the oomph behind it from when they started it. So like if we want to say that's actually a priority, we need to show, right? We need to be investing money into it and program development and things along those lines, right? Yeah. So it's something to think about of, like what are the tangible actions organizations like APA can actually take, right, to make a difference and not just make this lip service? And like I said, they're still figuring it out, and they're certainly still just having lip service at times. And so this is the timeline I just showed you. And so I kind of already addressed this as well. But, you know, again, just sort of keeping in mind the import of acknowledging what we've done, but then moving past just being like, oh, we acknowledged it, check, right? And that becomes really important. What are ways that we still see, if you think about, you know, in your site classes or textbooks, what are ways that we still see racism perpetuated by psychology? And again, I can kick us off here just within the field of eating disorders. For a really long time and still today, people just assume that basically only white girls get eating disorders, and in fact, that's not true. Right? One of my favorite autobiographies is Roxane Gay's, where she talks about it called Hunger, and she talks about her history of disordered eating. There's another great book called Not All Black Girls in Money, right? And it's not that these people don't have eating disorders, it's that we've not been studied. And that's problematic, right? Yeah, things to think about. Sorry, I just realized this is like a really heavy conversation to come back from Paul Brook about, but these are really important things to think about within psychology, right? So on Wednesday, what we'll be doing is a couple activities related to bias in the science of psychology. So we'll leave off there for today, and I'll see y'all then.